Well, greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us on a gray midday event in Durham. Although if you look at our friend Abdullah and Tepli's screen, he's pretending it's a beautiful sunny day here in North Carolina. We are thrilled to have you and, of course, our distinguished guests here to talk about a very important topic, which is part of our Focus on Israel series, the third event and last event on this topic as part of this series for this year in the American Grand Strategy Program. And we're talking about the Abraham Accords today, which are a series of agreements between Israel and a number of countries in the Arab and North Africa world, the UAE, Sudan, Morocco, and Bahrain, which the United States is a joint signator on each of these four agreements. And really, they're significant for a couple of reasons. First of all, they're really new. It's a breakthrough. It's a new approach that we're looking at. You know, a lot of things in the Middle East seem stalemated, aren't changing. I mean, if you look at even the Israeli political scene, it seems like a movie. It seems like Groundhog Day, with 4 elections in such a short time. And it's also significant that we're at the beginning of the Biden administration, and naturally, as happens often with changes of administrations, the new administration is doing a lot to change and in many ways reverse some of the approaches to foreign affairs by the Trump administration. But it's very significant that early on, Secretary of State Tony Blinken said, you know, quite candidly that the new administration wants to build on these Abraham Accords. So it's really significant for that reason and worth us delving into. So we're thrilled to have you and our distinguished guests to examine this. And let me turn it over to my colleague and friend and associate professor at the Sanford School to introduce our guests, Abdullah and Tepli.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us. Abraham Accord caught a lot of people by surprise. Many people didn't see this coming, but not our 2 distinguished guests. They knew this was coming. They were involved personally and professionally, different aspects of conceiving this idea, and has been closely involved and engaging since the Abraham Accord has been signed. We have 2 very distinguished guests. Ms. Najat Al-Saied is a Saudi-American independent academic researcher in political communication and social development based in Dubai, UAE, and Dr. Boms is a research fellow at Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University, and he is the chairman of the Syria Research Forum and the coordinator of Tel Aviv University's workshop on Israel and the Middle East. So with no further ado, their extensive and incredibly impressive bios have been shared as part of this program. Let's dive in. Nir, I would like to start with you. In a brief way, can you please help us understand what Israel is trying to achieve by this Abraham Accord? What are some of the gains, aspirations, and dreams, and benefits and wins for Israel being part of this Abraham Accord?
Well, Dr. Tepliy, you know, when looking at your background and when you're looking at aspirations and dreams, then please allow me to begin with a dream, with the dream of peace. And with the dream, if you take a more solid political reality perspective, with the dream of recognition. Israel, of course, was established in 1948, and when you look at the Israeli narrative and the history of wars that had lasted certainly for the first half of the existence of the country, this has been a struggle to remain in the region, a struggle to have recognition of our neighbors, of our rights to exist as a country and as a people. That narrative, certainly when it comes with the context of the Israeli-Arab perspective, has never been a smooth one. And the challenge remained of creating recognition and understanding between us and our neighbors that our right is to be in this particular land, the land of our ancestors. This why when Sadat came to Jerusalem in 1978, this has been something that had galvanized really the entire country. This is why there were many in Israel who had joined the peace movement overall. This has been a big part and parcel of the political debate here. And we were able to achieve that with Egypt and with Jordan. And all of that is connected to this aspiration of peace. Peace is the most common word mentioned in Jewish prayers on the one hand, and on the other hand, this is part and parcel of the wish of the country to be recognized by its neighbors so we can have normalcy, that we will be able to really focus on what we know how to focus on, and being a startup nation rather than being a military nation. And even if we were to take it to even more personally, many of us, we all serve in the military. I myself am an IDF officer. We have a closet at home. Many people do, where you have uniform. This is the uniform to use for reserve. My father had them. They were put there when I was growing up, and I remember always the sentence, "May you would not need ever to open that closet. May you would not have the need to take your uniform and go up to fight," because the alternative is much more appealing. And therefore, when we were able to get now to the Abraham Accords and having additional neighbors, further away neighbors, but nevertheless, that are not only willing to have an agreement of normalization, but are willing to also offer a different prism of the relations in the Middle East, and are coming to this not just with well, of course, land for peace issues is not relevant here, but they're coming with a formula of different relations in the region. This has been something extremely important from a very practical perspective, but also from the broader regional architecture that now is challenged, and perhaps we'll have a chance to speak more about that.
Thank you very much, Nir. The same question, Najat. I think what is in that for Israel is somewhat understandable and predictable. A lot of people can see Israel joining to this accord, this normalization. But what is it in it for UAE? What are their gains, and what made them join this is not always very clear. That was a bigger surprise for many. Why do you think UAE joined this accord?
Okay. First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me and for giving me this really good opportunity to expose all of these important questions to the student and to the university. Let me start first of all, why I thought that this is good from the beginning, years ago. So the main reason for me saying that this will be really helpful for and mutual benefit for both Israel and mainly the Arab Gulf states, because I can see quite similarities between Israel and the Arab Gulf states mainly. The main difference between the Arab Gulf states and other Arab countries, they are very pragmatic, and they don't work with slogans. They work with interests, and with they're actually you can call them doers, and they're very business-minded. And their main what you call establishment is their nationalism. And I see this is quite similar to the establishment of Israel, because also Israel is based on the Israeli nationalism, which is basically, if you want to go by the book, it is Zionism. Zionism, has a lot of negative definition in the Arab world, but it's actually Israeli nationalism. They have the concept of building a statehood. And this is what most, unfortunately, Arab state is lacking, and mainly what I see, unfortunately, to the Palestinians. You won't build a statehood through slogans and through identities like Arab nationalism or Islamism. You have to have the mindset of pragmatism and nationalism in order to build your statehood. And I see that in the statehood of Israel. They have this concept of statehood. And that's why I was longing for this peace treaty a long time ago, years ago, before the Abraham Accord. Let me return back to your question and to answer you why this is so important to UAE. First of all, there are strategic objectives and economic objectives. Let me start with the strategic objectives. There are geopolitical priorities for UAE. Israel is aligned with these priorities in terms of opposition to the Iranian regime, and its acquiring of a nuclear weapon. and also opposition to political Islam in general and the Muslim Brotherhood in particular. This is number one. Number two, the UAE's approach in this peace treaty has been to expose those in the region who want to manipulate the Israel-Palestine dispute for their own agendas. For instance, Turkey, and specifically its ambitious populist leader, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has sought to exploit the Palestinian grievances to further its hegemony and influence in the region. Thirdly, the need for the Arab Gulf states to have Israel as an ally has never been greater in the face of both parties in the US, calling for disengagement from the Middle East. This shift of US interests away from the region has prompted the UAE to engage in a peace process. So this is the strategic objectives. Let us go to the economic objectives. The Abraham Accords list 16 areas of Israeli-UAE collaboration, including health, science, technology, cybersecurity, environment, agriculture, and water and food security, as well as more strictly commercial areas such as civil aviation, tourism, and energy. According to the Israeli Ministry of Economy, estimates that the normalization of ties between Israel and the UAE led to as much as $500 million in bilateral trade and investment. In addition, after the signature of a peace treaty, many steps have been that suggest that it is not only economic deal between governments, but also business among people. For example, the UAE-Israel Business Council that was established by business and public sector leaders from the UAE and Israel to help foster shared opportunities, economic cooperation and business partnerships between Emiratis and Israelis. It had more than 2,000 members sign up for UAE-Israel Business Portal in less than 45 days. Moreover, the UAE-Israel Policy Forum was established to bring researchers, academic, and scholars from both countries together. The Gulf Israel Women's Forum was also established last October. Jerusalem Deputy Mayor Fleur Hassan, with founder of Jewish Women's Business Network, Justin Zwerling, started the Gulf Women's Forum to unite women from the Middle East in relationship, friendship, and business. The UAE, this is very, and let me just, finalize why this is adding to the strategic and economic objectives. The UAE see this peace treaty, and mainly one piece, part of the Emirati model for development and modernization. The UAE has ambitious development plans and global aspiration embodied in the UAE Vision 2021, which is keen to build relationship with more developed countries. And you couldn't exclude Israel from those developed countries. So UAE see this peace treaty as part of its development and modernization model. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I have a question for both of you, which is a lot of the advocates of these accords have actually compared them quite favorably to the peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan, which, although they've been quite long-lasting and stable, have not led to a kind of a warm peace, but rather, and some call it a cold peace. And I'm wondering why, of course, it's still the early stages of all of these agreements, but why do you see these accords of having more potential to create more lasting linkages to the people, more trade, business ties than the treaties with Israel's immediate neighbors, Jordan and Egypt?
Well,
Let me start first here.
David, I think that the short answer for this question is connected to what my colleague just articulated. It's the mode and the philosophy of the countries in question. You see countries, and the Abraham Accords, by the way, it's not about a particular country. UAE may symbolize that. but deliberately you see that there is no names of countries there because it's a conceptual document that invites others to join it. It's a process. It's a process that is already begins with a different premise. So if I were to juxtapose all these examples that Najat just articulated with the civic society, business sector, women organizations, all this cooperation, and afterwards, if you wish, I can tell more because I've been, as Najat has, been a part of some of these collaborations and engagements. And by the way, much before these agreements have begun, to Egypt. So in the peace process peace agreement with Egypt, we have an interesting clause of establishing 2 academic centers, one in Cairo and one in Tel Aviv. The one in Cairo, the Israeli Academic Center in Cairo, was established. Broadly speaking, Egyptians are not allowed to enter. The one academic center, the Egyptians one in Tel Aviv, is still waiting, for over 30 years to be created. And this is really perhaps the big difference. With now we, on the other hand, here we talk about a very burgeoning of civic society engagements, delegations that are going back and forth, open discussions. It's much easier to speak now to an Emirati or even a Saudi than to have an Egyptian or a Jordanian to be a member of the panel like this. And that's probably gives you a sense that this is a little bit different.
Najat, would you like to comment on that same question?
Yes. First of all, I mentioned part of it, that UAE sees it as part of its model of development and modernity. It's not only they're doing it because they're forced to do it, and it's not for their favor to make it cold peace. The other thing, I call the peace in Egypt and Jordan, I call it no war peace. It's not even cold peace. And for us in the Gulf, and for me personally, I always look at the Egyptian movies, the anti-Semitic and the anti-Israeli movies, Egyptian movies, as ridiculous, because I lived in the United States and I hanged out with Israelis and with American Jews, and most of those Egyptian movies that brainwash most of the people do not make sense of people who are exposed to American Jews or to Israelis. So I said, what those people are trying to do, and I wrote about that a lot, and I'm heading to write a chapter about that. So they play the role. So I see it kind of double standard. When you make a peace or don't make it. You don't make peace with governments and you keep the hostile rhetoric at the same time. Nir came here and he was part of the delegation, and he can see the warm peace because the people are serious about it, especially the younger generation and the businessmen are so excited about it. This is number one. Number two, there wasn't actually a direct war between the Israelis and the people from and the Arab Gulf states. We don't, Israel was never ever a first threat to the Arab Gulf countries. The first national security threat to all the Arab Gulf countries is the Iranian regime, is not Israel. Israel was never an enemy. We sided with, we were like against them because of the Palestinians, not because there's a direct hostility between us and Israelis. There's nothing direct between us. This is one of the main thing why this is different than the Egyptian and the Jordanian peace. Also, thirdly, even though the Emirati leadership support the two-state solution, but is also keen to build a nation and develop an economy that is free from hateful ideologies. So the UAE sees through this warm peace or bottom-up approach, especially among the young generation, has two advantages. One, first of all, it is a way to kill these hateful ideologies. Second, also establishment of a Palestinian state free from hateful ideologies and more focus on stability and prosperity for its people. So this is what the UAE is trying to do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
They're trying indirectly or subtly to say, yeah, you will not build an independent state with hateful ideologies. That's the main thing.
Thank you. I have a follow-up, and then I'm sure Abdullah wants to probe more deeply into the question of the impact on Palestinian-Israeli relations. Nears, especially for you, I was wondering if you have any concerns about whether these accords are on a firm geopolitical foundation. Yes, the Biden administration said they want to build on the accords, but there was a transactional element really to each of them. For example, with the UAE, there's questions about the sales of F-35s, which the Biden administration has specifically said is under review. And that's especially interesting in light of the Biden administration's position on any armaments relating to the conflict in Yemen. When asked about recognition of Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara, which was another major concession the Trump administration made, the White House spokesperson again said that aspects of the Abraham Accords are under review. And of course, the Trump position is contrary to the United Nations position on the Western Sahara. So I'm wondering if you're concerned about some of the transactional nature of the accords and whether they are truly on a firm foundation at this point.
Well, David, I believe they are on a firmer base than many perhaps envision. And some of what we've said here, and please allow me now to go deeper, may articulate that. I mean, the timing of the agreement and then the transactional dimension may have to do with the particular circumstances, the end of the Trump era that have triggered some of these really developments. But what I think both of us are saying that the real developments were much deeper and had less to do with the United States. And they also had less to do with the particular timing of the given year. There were Israelis who began the process of engagement with the Gulf, and there were over 500 Israeli companies actively working in the Gulf. There were over 70,000 Israeli tourists going to Morocco much before the Abraham Accords. But not only that, if you're looking broadly at the Arab Spring, and this is part of the reorientation that my colleague Najat was referring to, I think you're beginning to see a broader Middle Eastern debate that perhaps if I were to frame it, it's between politics of resistance and politics of renaissance. The old camp of politics of resistance that comprises of ideologies, Islamist ideology, the Muslim Brothers, countries like Qatar and Turkey, the axis of resistance, Iran, Hezbollah, and those who, on the one hand, and then the Arab Spring that have seen turmoil, political crisis, and then a number of failed states. All of that dynamic produced two interesting things. First of all, the old capitals of the Middle East, Cairo, Baghdad, Beirut, have been weakened. I mean, Beirut has been burning. Cairo, in many ways, has been hungry. Baghdad has been bombed. Damascus is still suffering from a war. The place that remains a bit more stable and understanding that there are other threats coming their way is the Gulf. And they sought two threats. A threat that comes from the outside, Iran, and a threat that comes potentially from the inside, the rise of these types of radical forces coming that can come their way. And they realize that the people who rally for these radical forces are the axis of resistance. They're the ones who would call, including the Muslim Brothers. This is why they were so afraid of them. And they basically also realized something else, that when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the people who are concerned about this are the same people, those who are a part of the axis of resistance. And at some point, it became evident that we need, when we are pushing them aside to one side, perhaps we need to push moderate force on the other side. And perhaps we need to think of a different model, not a win-lose model. One have to conquer another or win another. We have to figure out how to work together in order to bring about progress and prosperity, which is what the young people in the Middle East would like. So I'm arguing here that the Abraham Accords are resting on these ideas, on these developments. 2014 were the years where the UAE, Egypt, Saudi Arabia all have moved the Muslim Brotherhoods to designate them as terrorist organizations, including, by the way, a number of Arab American organizations that for the UAE until today, they're considered terrorist organizations. This is a significant change because it joins a different orientation of how we need to look at the region. And if I were to even refer to a scholar that I assume is still very well known in the United States, and I'm sure that many of the students here read it, for Al-Saied, who had tried to convince us that the entire scholarship in the Middle East needs to rest on post-colonial sort of analysis with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the core of understanding the Middle East. Then part of this move is going in the exact opposite direction, trying to say that, look, the Middle East does not rest on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Middle East has other challenges, and we need to work together as pragmatics and moderates in the region in order to fight threats that come in from radical and the resistant axis. And this is the basis of the Abraham Accords, much more than F-35s.
That's a very good
Oh,
segue.
why then was this, were these transactional elements included in the Accords? They seemed like they were needed to push these states. If they were truly motivated by kind of reframing resistance versus renaissance and so on, then they should have been willing to enter into these Accords without the diving into the controversy over the Western Sahara and the sale of extremely sophisticated weaponry to UAE, which has caused which is involved in this conflict in Yemen, which is classified as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world right now. So why do those things why do they have to be included if there were so many other motivators?
Look, I was not the one involved in the room negotiating these particular pieces of the agreement. But I think that what President Trump had done, that he was able to use additional factors or, if you will, carrots to push and seal a process that became ripe. If it wouldn't have been now, perhaps it would have been next year or 2 years down the road, then I'm sure, by the way, part of that was also the opportunity or the pressure regarding annexation that could have been prevented within the context of the Abraham Accord. So you have to find the timing and the ripeness of trying to seal something that his time has come. This is also why I think that now, when the Biden administration is reviewing some of this, perhaps they're going to have a particular decision on the F-35s or on the war in Yemen. But I don't think that's going to change the fundamentals of this dynamic or reverse it. I think I was trying to argue that these routes have a far more stable basis.
Thank you. Go
Thank
ahead,
you.
Abdullah.
Yeah, Najat, I think you said it beautifully earlier. Why UAE, Bahrain, Morocco didn't have any relationship with Israel in the first place was not because of any direct conflict. It was because of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And what changed on that front? What developments have changed? And some of the most fervent critiques of Abraham Accord is people who point out the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Without solving this, without any viable peace and solution on the table for these countries to have these bilateral agreements, and ignoring this conflict is setting the region into much bigger failures. Some of the critiques are coming from that department. What do you say?
Okay. Thank you so much for asking me this question. It's a good question, but I will start first of all regarding the first part of what has been mentioned by my colleague Anir.
Sure.
There are two axes in the region: the axis of moderation and the axis of resistance. When we face the axis of resistance, you have to face them with two things: soft power and hard power. That's why this is part of the reason why UAE, for example, was asking of buying the F-35, because it is surrounded with this kind of axis of resistance that it is a threat to its national security. So here they need both fight the soft power of the ideologies, and you fight that through one peace, through people-to-people peace, through the media, through the educational system. All of that is using the soft power, but also you need a hard power for it. The same thing for Morocco. Okay, let me go quickly to your question. Okay, when you have a peace process that goes through a stage of stalemate for many years, changes are needed, and thinking out of the box can generate no approaches. So this Israeli-Palestinian conflict hasn't happened only 1 year or 2 years or 5 or 10 years ago. It lasted for more than 70 years. And they have tried many approaches. And it is time to change and try another approach. The first model for peace was land for peace. And this was the basis of the 1979 peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. Did it work? No, it didn't work. Then they tried the second model, was identified by the Arab Peace Initiative led by Saudi Arabia in 2002, and demanded that Israel withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza in order to establish a Palestinian state. Did it work? No, it didn't work. So now they tried the Abraham Accord, which is the latest model. It is to have the annexation of the West Bank in order to normalize and progress the peace process. Okay, so that's why they tried to be initiative. They tried to think out of the box. It didn't work directly. Let us work with it indirectly. So the new model is different because it is not demanding a Palestinian state immediately, calling instead for a first step in the right direction to achieve that. It views the Abraham Accords not as a deal, but rather a national and strategic option in which the people also are involved. So it is both top-down and bottom-up approach, preparing future leaders who are problem solvers.
If I may interrupt you really quickly, Najat, then what is this accord's direct or indirect long-term contribution to the Palestinian problem? What exactly through this accord will change the realities on the ground vis-a-vis Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the situation in West Bank and Gaza? Because
it's good that
you doesn't really
you brought
state
up this
very publicly.
It doesn't state it, but let me tell you what the people in the Gulf are saying. They're saying if now we have an independent Palestinian state, this independent Palestinian state definitely will be pro-Iranian regime and pro the Muslim Brotherhood against us, because they are dominated by those hateful ideologies. That's what is worrying all the Arab Gulf people, not only the governments, even the people themselves. They're saying we are paying them billions of dollars, and they are cursing us, and they are complimenting the Iranian regime and the Muslim Brotherhood. So what's going on? Am I going to create and work for something that is going to be my hostile enemy? So this is what I'm telling you, that things that are not shown in the media, what the people here are saying, not only the government, the people are worried. So a lot of people are saying that this new accord can train the new generation of the Palestinians to think more logically and to use their reason instead of the hostility that they are raised up. Look at the curriculum of the Palestinian students. It's all full of hatred. Look at their media. So how come we can rely on such a Palestinian state? This is not including the corruption of the Palestinian leadership. Where did our money go to? We donate to them billions of dollars. Did they invest that in the infrastructure in the Palestinian territory? Look at the difference between the Israeli services and the Palestinian services. Palestinians are running in the Israeli side to get the health services, the employment services. So what are you doing with the billions that we are giving you? That means that there's a huge corruption. So how we can talk about two-state solution if there are hostile ideologies and also there is corruption. So that's the main thing that we have to talk about. And I see this Abraham Accord is an excellent step because it will train the new generation. Look, if you don't know how to work out peace, we will train you how to work out peace. Now look at the difference. If you are saying that the Israelis are enemies, according to what you're saying 24/7 in your media, but what we saw in Israel, like the Emirati delegation that visited Israel, they saw something totally different. And they were writing that in the Emirati media, something that we haven't heard in the whole 72 years. They are talking that they are nice people, they encourage for coexistence, they want peace. So why we see something different in the media? So people are saying the same thing. The Jewish delegations that are visiting UAE, they are shocked They're saying we feel safer in UAE than the United States and Europe, something that we haven't heard. Can you believe it? Can you believe it? That was even declared by the Jewish.
Thank you.
Jewish
Heartwarming, subjective experiences of some individuals. I understand, but to my ears, at least, some of your very legitimate criticism to Palestinian leadership and the corruption, etc., to a certain extent, I know they are true. I spent a lot of time in the region, but also there's a tone of blaming victim here for the failures of peace processes. I know enough that the failures of peace processes or solutions are not exclusively because of the issues that you have mentioned, but of course they played a role. Nir, what about you? From where you look, how do you see this accord and how it's unfolding, making any positive or negative contribution to Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
You know, there is a famous conversation between Aristo and Socrates when he shows him a grain, and he says, "What is this?" He says, "This grain? No, this is the potential of being what it can be when it grows." The truth and the answer here has to do with what we'll be able to do with it. Now, I speak to you as an Israeli who is also involved, as an Israeli who has been a part of the peace movement. I should spend a lot of time with Palestinians, many hours of conversations. I created an organization that deals with Israeli-Palestinian issues, and that takes people to go together, study the land, study history. Studying the past in order to understand the present and then to change the future. And the last few years, of course, have been very difficult. But I think that the potential here of the Abraham Accords, if it is utilized correctly, is great. And of course, if it's not utilized, it's going to be another sad chapter in the Israeli-Palestinian report. And let me get into what that is.
What's that potential? What this accord in its best case scenario could contribute to Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
It can contribute to things. The important thing that it contributes is the idea of a win-win formula, and a formula that takes normalization as a positive and not as a negative. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, certainly in the last few years, have been surrounded with an anti-normalization discourse, with the idea that the only way to move something forward is to push, sometimes with the BDS, with the boycott movement, so other countries will push Israel, so it will at some point give back, and then the Palestinian will end some sort of a victory. But this dimension had gone so deep up to the point that even peace groups were not able to work because they are normalizing. Normalizing is a crime. Up to the fact that, it became so deep that if I'll just take one example, last May, there was a plane coming from the UAE with corona medicines. The Palestinians refused to accept it. They made it, they said, it's landed in Israel. That's normalization, recognition. We're willing to give up all the corona aid just to make sure that the normalization principle is adhered. And I think the Abraham Accords are able to challenge that. And I also think that as somebody who deeply believes that we have the responsibility to move the Israeli-Palestinian process for the sake of our own future here, but we cannot move a process without speaking to each other, recognizing each other, normalizing with each other. Normalization is the objective, not the obstacle. And I think the Abraham Accords are saying two things, or three things actually. First of all, they say that the formula with normalization in the middle is not necessarily negative. No, it can actually be a win-win. And it's also saying that it's able to prevent Israel from actually doing something. And the third thing it can say is, look what you can gain if we're moving in that path, how we can find a model that is going to be a win-win. But it also does something which Najat touched on. It is basically saying the following thing. It says, look, you have a choice here for the Palestinians. You can choose to join and you can choose not to join. But the region and us are not going to be able to wait forever for your choice, or held hostage by your choice to join or not to join. There are other things that will need to move here, irrespective of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that perhaps brings the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into its right perspective, into its right size. It's not the only conflict in the region. It's not the largest conflict in the region. It's not even the most important conflict in the region, although it's extremely important to us and for me, to somebody who lives in the region, who lives in Jerusalem, who lives a few minutes away from the Green Line, and who spends a lot of time with Palestinians. We need to do a lot to move forward. But perhaps if we bring it to the right scale and scope, we will actually be able together to move forward and bring about new models, because that's what we need. If we're going to stick with this, with no normalizations and no engagement and nothing, then we're not going to be able to move forward. And I think that has been clear to anyone who's seen it.
Thank you.
Neers, it's very interesting perspective, and I think the idea of new models and idea of normalization and talks does contribute in a positive way. But if you listen carefully to what Najat was saying, that's kind of ratifying the worst nightmares of the Palestinians, which is that basically the Gulf states and those who are entering into the Abraham Accords are essentially hostile to the concept of Palestinian statehood. And, in some ways, it's very much music to Prime Minister Netanyahu's ears, because it's essentially saying the whole region is going to be structured on the conflict with Iran, and putting a problem that he has shown over his entire tenure he does not want to deal with, which is the Israeli-Palestinian accord, and it's heightening the issue and allowing him to deflect away from that problem to focus exclusively on the Iranian conflict. So it does seem to have some very negative potential and connotations for a Palestinian peace process going forward in that regard, doesn't it?
Well, I'm not going to ignore these factors. And also, I'm not going to ignore the discourse that exists, the inter-Arab discourse. I mean, you've heard very prominent Saudi speakers speak about these issues, but really, they spoke about the Palestinian leadership. And if you are zooming out from this, and you're back, and you're trying to distill what's the main message here, I think the main message here is we need a different tone. On the one hand, and I think Najat had said it very clearly, we are not looking to support, we cannot, under the banner of Arab solidarity or the Palestinian cause, can agree with a pro-Iranian or a very radical agenda. That should change and needs to change. And there are voices among the Palestinians who think in these terms. And I think there are voices, there are Palestinian voices. I speak to some of these people who see these things clearly. And they also understand that, with all the respect, we need to stop this win-lose scenarios, that the only way to move forward is to engage. Again, I will repeat what I've said before. This notion that was advocated by the quote-unquote BDS mindset, in where the only way to move forward is to not engage at all and try to ask other people to do something in order for something to change, had completely failed. When the Israelis and the Palestinians eventually need to negotiate a divorce, the complex relationship here, relationship that are among the family, they need to figure out, my apartment, your apartment, how are we going to divide the property, and figure out how we're going to keep the children somewhat intact. If you're going to end up just running around and just involving a whole bunch of international lawyers, paying them a lot of money in order to continue this endless negotiations, we're not going to have a divorce, and trust me, the children are not going to be happier. I'm not sure if that's analogy is useful, but perhaps it captures a little bit of this. And now we have a chance to say, why don't we look at this differently? Why don't we think, like Najat said, outside the box? And let's figure out if we can find partners. There are plenty of Israeli partners that would be willing to move forward with this. And I think history had shown it in the past. And there may be Palestinian partners that are willing to do it, but they need to find those that are willing to accept this mindset. And that's not going to happen if they're going to reject everyone, including, by the way, many of their friends from the Gulf.
Well, thank you so much for your passion on and really insightful comments. I think it's very, very helpful for us to hear all of these views.
Dr. David,
let me just hold on one second. Hold on one second.
Because you said
let me just hold on one second.
I just want to something that
hold on
said.
just one
the
second.
Arab Gulf states are not hostile against the Palestinian state.
Najat, I'll give you a chance. Hold on. I want to invite our students to start asking questions by sending Rebecca Dudley comments in the chat. And so we have a chance to turn to them. And let me at this stage also mention our upcoming events. Tomorrow we have Charles Kupchan, who's written an excellent book on US isolationism. He'll be having a discussion with Bruce Gentleson. I'm sorry I don't have the time, but it's on your AGS schedule. Next Friday, students have a real treat, an opportunity to have a small group meeting with Professor Matt Peralt, former Facebook employee and our guru on all things tech policy. And then the following week, we're having Moises Naim to talk about US Latin America relations, and a topic we really haven't had a chance to touch on this year in AGS. So we're really excited to welcome this important speaker and authority on Latin America. So Najat, let me just ask you, and then you can say what you wanted to comment about Nir's point. But
I'm not going to comment on Nir's point. I'm going to comment on your comment. You
Sure.
said that the Arab Gulf states are hostile to Palestine. No, they're not hostile. I'm telling you what the people are worried about from the Palestinian reaction. The question is as simple as this, and I will end it quickly. Will we have a stable and prosperous Palestinian state under this corrupt Palestinian leadership? That's it. This is the question that I want everybody to think about. This is the main key question. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, no, thank you. So I wanted to ask about this aspect of the accords which were relating to annexation, and that was an important part where it was insisted on that the Netanyahu government turn away from its move towards annexation of the West Bank, which was given a partial a green light in the Trump plan, not a full green light, but at least a partial green light in the Trump peace plan. And I'm wondering, what is the UAE doing to essentially make that, monitor that and make that a reality? Israel continues to take steps to expand settlements, even post-Abraham Accords, and take other steps that are not fully, are not annexation, but are also making any sort of land for peace kind of swap less and less practical and possible on the ground. So is the UAE taking an active role in monitoring these things, given that part of the accords itself was to prevent Israeli annexation on the ground?
Yes, of course. Actually, since the beginning, the UAE is using the accord to monitor the situation and engage in dialogue on Israeli actions from the very beginning. And that was illustrated in the Hebrew language opinion edition published in Israeli newspaper, Yedot Ahronot. The article that was written by the UAE ambassador to Washington, D.C., Yusuf Al-Ateba, it is called Annexation to Normalization. So as if he's putting the condition of normalization with annexation. That was clear from the beginning. He wrote that article back in June 2020. So that's very, very, very crucial. He also added in this, one of the most important sentences in this article, in the UAE and across much of the Arab world, we would like to believe Israel is an opportunity, not an enemy. And in order to do that, they have to stop the annexation. Al-Utayba wrote, adding, we face too many common dangers and see the great potential of warmer ties. And here, I want to emphasize on the warmer ties. So in fact, the opinion edition was not a simple warning from Abu Dhabi to the Israelis, but this is a key message from the UAE via its key Washington ambassador to remove any obstacle from stopping this peace process. In other words, it is saying that any obstacle in the annexation will hinder the warm peace they are aiming for. That was even much more emphasized by the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed. He stated that the agreement with Israel will not come at the expense of the Palestinian cause. On August 31, 2020, addressing the sections of the Palestinian community living in the UAE, Foreign Minister Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed affirmed that the normalization of ties with Israel was for the sake of delivering a peaceful future in the region. He assured the community, which is the Palestinian community living in UAE, that these unshakable bonds between the UAE and the Palestinians will remain solid and will never change. So the Abraham Accord is not to ignore the annexation or to ignore the Palestinian cause. It's basically using another approach and another model for solving this issue. Since this issue has lasted for more than 70 years, they are thinking of other solutions. So they tried of this indirect way, and definitely they will be monitoring this. And the history taught us Arab countries that have direct relationship and full diplomatic relationships with Israel are more active in monitoring and solving problems than those who are cutting the relations. It's very hard to be involved in solutions while you are cutting the relations. That's
okay,
the main
thank you.
thing.
Let's turn to some questions from our students. Our first one is from Ash Javeri.
Hi, thank you so much for being with us. I really enjoyed this conversation. I was kind of just wondering how, with the new Biden administration probably taking, different stances towards Iran and Saudi Arabia, how that will kind of, how this Abraham Accords will kind of set up that sort of, I don't know, confrontation or negotiations with those two countries, and kind of, what holes is President Biden kind of narrowed down into based on these?
To be more specific, Ash, you mean a little bit tougher stand on Saudi Arabia, more warm and diplomatic engagement with Iran? How is this going to affect? Very good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, Nir.
I believe if it will do anything, it will actually strengthen this bond. And I would even say that if we go back a few years to President Obama, I will actually give him some credit also to the process that have led to the Abraham Accords. Why? For the very simple reason. This engagement, the American engagement with the Middle East, and particularly the message that America is actually disengaged, and the message that America is flirting further with Iran and potentially hurting the interest of many of its allies in the region, is what pushed these allies to move further together and to give some messages also to America, but also to its regional allies, basically saying, look, guys, we got to deal with our own issues. America is not necessarily going to be there to save us. And if America is not going to be there to save us, we better do what we can with each other. And if we have some serious concerns and joint concerns, we better find a way to work with each other, because you're not going to have a third party, even the US of A, to do this work for us. So I think that actually, if that's what is going to be the direction, Biden's direction, it will actually strengthen the bond because it very much connects to its very basis and pillars.
Okay, our next question is from Graham Wood.
Hello, I have two questions. So my first one is, as China continues to support Tehran, how has the PRC been involved with the Abraham Accords, if they've been involved at all? And my second question is, as the US looks to leave the Middle East and Middle Eastern nations are moving to align with Israel, will Israel, the UAE, and other Middle Eastern nations step up in countering the Iranian terror regime and their spread across the Middle East?
Najat, you want to start?
Anybody want to talk about
Okay.
China first? And China's engagement in the Gulf?
Yeah, I will
think
keep the China question to Nir, and I will answer his second part for the question.
Sure, go ahead. Let's start with Iran.
Najat, please start.
Okay. Answering to your question regarding, yes, and I mentioned that part of the strategic objectives of the peace treaty, that there will be an alliance, Israel with the Abraham Accord countries and mainly the Arab Gulf countries to oppose the Iranian regime, and mainly its acquiring of the nuclear weapon, and also for in opposition for its like funding militias in the region. So this is part of very important alliance that will happen, and I see it quite useful, because it's very hard to keep dependent on the United States forever. The United States is hundreds of miles away from the region, and to have a new ally now with the Arab Gulf countries, and especially the ones who did signed the Abraham Accord countries, is very, very crucial, because as I said, part of the UAE's part of the UAE's motivation to make the peace with Israel because of its development in many fields. A part of it is the military and the technology. So yes, they need this alliance definitely because they have a lot of mutual interests in the region, and they agree on a lot of things. And the other question, what was it about China? China is helping Iran.
Maybe Nir can weigh in that China part.
Yeah, sure. Look, China attempts to keep close ties with all of its regional rivals as well, and with the Belt plan, it's important because of the nature of involvement in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, and in Egypt. China actually welcomed the Abraham Accords, not in a very assertive way, partially because of the tensions with the US, but the Chinese Foreign Ministry issued a welcoming message saying it will contribute to stability in the region. China would like to find a solution in where it can continue the Belt and Road initiative to keep trade relations with all the partners, including Iran, by the way, and continue to increase its economic and overall political influence. It did not take a more deeper stand to side one party over the other. It tried to keep economic neutrality with economic center. That's probably the best way to describe China's policy in the region. It's growing. And it's interesting to note, really, that the Chinese involvement is growing, the Russian involvement is growing, the American involvement, on the other hand, seems to be somewhat diminishing.
So we have another question, but first there was somewhat of an objection to some of the terminology used towards Iran, more by the questioner than the guest. And, everybody's has a right to characterize different countries, how they see them. And certainly folks who want to participate and have a different view about Iran are certainly welcome to ask a question. I realize we don't have a kind of Iranian expert on this panel, but you can't have an expert on every issue at every panel, so we do the best that we can. I think the next person to ask a question is Noemi.
Hi, I wanted to ask a little bit. We talked about the cultural shifts and how sentiment within populations and not just governments has evolved and has been changing. And I wanted to ask what the value and what the true meaning behind some of the little things, like the inclusion of Jewish history in Moroccan textbooks, which was a very big change. And what does that reflect? And is that more of a reflection on popular sentiment, or is it more a reflection on government agenda, or a combination of both?
Very good question. Thank you. And are there more examples of that?
Look, let me start here. I think there are more examples of this, and I think, Naomi, that this is an example of both. As somebody who works in civic society, I can tell you that in the last few years, we have seen very interesting conversations between, for example, Iraqis and Iraqi Jews. There have been a number of books that were translated to Arabic from Hebrew and were published and appeared in a number of Arabic book fairs. Iraq has been the predominant example of this. Morocco, long history there, a long Jewish history there, and even some Israeli relations, but the fact that the curriculum has changed is a good example. There have been other curriculums that have moved and changed a little bit, including, by the way, some positive changes in the Saudi curriculum and very significant changes already, including the Abraham Accords in the Emirati curriculum. Civic society is able to bridge some of these paths and these conversations taking place. But of course, in the Middle East and in countries controlled by leaders or sheikhs and kings, the coming from the top is extremely important and is an important key. However, what we're seeing here is a certain will, certainly with the Abrahamic Accords countries, to really prepare their population for that. We've seen different media. We've seen Israelis being published. This is now going over a decade and a half ago. For the first time, Israelis being published in Gulf-related publications, London-based and afterwards Gulf-based. And we've seen, sports competitions taking place in UAE when Israelis are invited and publicly and even winning. And even at one point, a couple of years ago, the Israeli national anthem was played because an Israeli judo champion was able to get a medal. All of these things are extremely important. They could not have been taken place without the people in the top. But this is the people that are the civic society piece of it is equally as important. This is about preparing people and pushing and showing that there is some willingness. This is not it's not that saying that all of the negativity and some of the anti-Semitism and the textbooks that still exist in many places. But we've seen at least some positive signs, certainly when it comes to the Abraham Accords countries.
Great. Thank you so much. We have another question from Rahul Sumant.
Hi, I have two questions, if I may. So the first one is, before UAE and Bahrain, people might remember that Netanyahu visited Oman. I was curious to know if anybody has a sort of opinion as to why Oman was not first before UAE and Bahrain. And the second question, which I think obviously would be for Nir, is Israel is obviously having elections pretty soon. And I was curious to know if the Abraham Accords has been a big sort of push for Netanyahu's political image. You guys have voters who are literally turning from anti-Netanyahu to Netanyahu because of the Abraham Accords. Thank you.
Thank you. Najat, can you address the first question? I don't know if you know the answer, but maybe you can opine on that.
Well, the answer to your question to that, there's no definite answer because I don't have facts about that. Why Oman wasn't one of those Arab Gulf countries that signed the Abraham Accord? Even though there was visiting before. Some analysis are saying, this is an analysis, not my opinion, because a lot of the Omani population is so much influenced by some ideologies from the Iranian regime, okay? Because the sect that is dominated in Oman is, they call it the Abadi, which is like semi the same sect of Iran. This is only an analysis that I read, but I'm not. This is not my analysis. I just read it. This is one of the reasons. And until now, the majority of the Omani people, not the government, see the signing such a treaty as betraying the Palestinian cause. That is one of the analysis, but I'm not definite about that. It's just only something that I read. I'm not sure about that, but sooner or later, maybe it's going to be one of those countries. You never know.
And I will only add to that there is engagement with Oman as well. We have a group that has over 1,500 members of the Israeli-Omani Friendship Association. It exists on Facebook. Of course, a lot of the things are not always visible, but engagement continues. When it comes to the elections, look, Netanyahu at times to portray the image of the top diplomat, say, I was late for this election event because I got the call from a regional leader. I can't tell you who he is, but we're working on it for other countries. So of course he marketed the Abraham Accord. This is part of the image, but this is also objectively a part of his achievement. I mean, it was under his tenure, and he has worked very hard on it. I've seen, and I've seen up close some of the engagements of his team on these issues, again, for a number of years. This is not something that happened just like that. These engagements have been taking place for a while. And I think it's also fair to say, in the context of Oman, that engagement with the UAE have been deeper, although not always public. And so this is part of the elections, but really the people here across, you know, I'm not going to even try to predict what will happen next week. I hope that is not going to be another stalemate where we'll have another fifth election system. The Abraham Accords is something that is very much in the consensus. There are very few people who would have negativity, you know, toward us. There are some people who will say, look, you know, we need to pay more attention to the Palestinian arena, not to forget this issue, which is a very fair statement and something that is important. But the overall image that Netanyahu is able to use as somebody who has been, you know, very active and involved in creating this is something that helps him. But he has many other issues that may influence whether he will be able to really create another government or not. And the Abraham Accord is just one. You know, all politics, as greater people now have said, you know, politics is local.
Thank you.
We have a question from Sarah Scanlon that's going to be read by Rebecca Dudley.
Hi, thank you. So Sarah unfortunately is unable to unmute herself to ask the question, so I will ask it on her behalf. She says, thank you so much for this discussion. It's been super interesting. And she has a question on how the United States' role in the Accords is viewed by the other countries in the Accords and the other countries in the region. In particular, the US has been a big player in the Accords, using a good bit of its own political capital to bring other countries into the agreements, including taking Sudan off the list of state sponsors of terrorism, as well as recognizing Morocco's claim to Western Sahara. Do you see the Abraham Accords as a shift at all in the US role in the Middle East, or is it more of a continuation of what US foreign policy has been in the region?
Who do you want to take that first?
Oh. Do you want me to start and you continue? As
Please,
you like.
Sure.
Okay. Okay. I see that it could be like the double sword. It could take it to a better way and it could make it worse. Actually, what has been done by the Abraham Accord, I see it as a win-win situation. It is positive from every angle. Now, with the new approach of the new administration, I know it is changing its diplomacy to certain countries, like for example the Iranian regime, from maximum pressure to maximum diplomacy. So this can be good and bad. If they use this maximum diplomacy to try to convince or persuade the Iranian regime in order to stop funding militias and stop inflaming those hateful ideologies, whether against other Arab countries or against Israel, and promoting anti-Semitism, that can be excellent. But but if they are, for example, keep continuing these kind of mixed signals, like for example trying to sign a peace or a nuclear deal with Iran, at the same time freezing weapons, buying weapons to UAE, that might backfire. So the Biden administration can really make it much more successful than what happened by the previous administration, and it can make it worse, because some of those hateful regimes or hateful militias see being nice, or they can take advantage of the United States being too diplomatic. If the United States played it really smartly and wittily, trying to be firm at the same time being soft and diplomatic, here where it comes successful. I don't know if Nir wants to continue, please, on that.
Well, as an outside observer of American politics, I know speaking to many of my American friends, it's very difficult for many of them to look at President Trump as anything that is a continuation of something that had happened before him, or a continuation of American policy. But I think that if you zoom out and zoom back into the Middle East, you can actually see more continuing lines. I think a fairly smart use of soft power and diplomacy in order to achieve some significant progress. And I think that many in the region appreciate at least that part of the American policy. And I also think that when it comes to now the new administration, that a lot of what was done is looked at in the context of what it should be look like. It's a progress. It's overall positive. It's not something that needs to be undone. It's not something like let's stop building defense or stop this policy domestically, as it was done the case. This is not something that President Biden woke up when he moved to the White House to undo the different policies. This is something different. And I think it will continue and outlast also another president. I think this is a change that is deeper. And I think that the fact that America played a role here is something that is going to be remembered also in the chronicles of history. It was other things political, there are circumstances and there are surrounding circumstances, and there's time in dimension. And eventually, in the end of the Corona year, before Trump leaves, all of it, now everybody needs to come and do it. And, putting some additional pieces into, including F-35s. But nevertheless, in the historical view, I think it helped put a very important phase forward.
Well, this has been a wonderful talk. Abdullah, do you have a closing thought before I say goodbye to our guests and close us out?
I just would like to express my gratitude to both Najat and Nir for this very rich and incredibly rewarding conversation. As it's very clear, the complicated realities of realpolitik, we weren't able to cover it all, but please keep staying tuned to future AGS events or relevant departments at Duke and UNC. There are so many scholars and experts are being invited as well. This shouldn't be beginning and the end of this conversation.
Well, let me extend my gratitude to both of our guests. I really do think it was very rich and a different dialogue than necessarily we've heard in America. So it's wonderful to have both of your perspectives. And just so it's clear, I'm trying to ask tough questions, not because I'm hostile at all to the Accords. I truly believe that as a supporter of Israel and a friend, anytime we're talking with and making peace with other nations, it's a positive thing. That doesn't mean there aren't issues to discuss as we have today. But many, many thanks to our guests. You'll both be receiving, it might take a while given international post, but you will be receiving Duke American Grand Strategy t-shirts in the mail. And many prominent Israelis have these shirts near, and I hope you'll wear it proudly at Tel Aviv University and at other spots, perhaps on the beaches and so on. And Najat, I don't know if we've had any guests from UAE before. So please, next time you're on television, I know you're on television frequently, or hobnobbing with the heads of government, please wear your Duke American Grand Strategy t-shirt so they know of our interest in your country. And with that, I will say, thank you again to our guests. Strangely enough, it's only March and it's still a little nippy out, but we are heading towards Passover. And what we say at the end of the Passover, and this is our last event focusing on Israel, so what we say at the end of the Passover dinner is Bashana Haba Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. And it's a call for both peace, but of course in this COVID year, the idea that next year we could possibly travel to Jerusalem would be a very welcome and thoughtful or hopeful way to end our program today. So thank you again to all of our guests and everyone who's participated. Thank you, Abdullah, for making this event possible and using your great connections and esteem in the region to put these events all year together. It's been a real partnership with you. And I hope we'll see people tomorrow for Charles Kupchan and for our upcoming events throughout the month towards the end of the semester. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of our staff, and thank you to Beth O'Brien and Bo Carlson for helping to put this event together. Until next time. Good afternoon.
Masal khair and Leila Tov.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.